This is the Web Platform, episode number 108, the Web Platform podcast. Woo!
You forgot a word right off the bat. Good start. Good start.
Actually, it's 109. Sorry. This is episode number 109, CSS Performance and Maintenance. And our guest today is going to be Harry Roberts, CSS Wizardry.
Hey, hello everyone.
On the panel, we got Mark Nadal.
Hey,
and me. Justin Ribeiro.
Why you continue to let me on this show is a mystery, but thank you for having me yet again.
And myself, Web Component Nut, Eric Isaacson. Before we start, I do want to say something that Justin and Leon Revel and I have been working on a remote conference for web components. And today we're going to release the CFP. So later on today, you should be able to access it. It'll be wcremoteconf.com. So if you want to do a talk on web components, it'll be a remote conference, so you don't have to like leave your home or anything. And it should be really fun. So
yeah,
definitely submit something.
That sounds good. So how do you run it? What time zones does it run? Can people just drop in whenever they want?
It's well, we're not sure the exact times because it depends on how many people we get, but it'll definitely be between 12 and 4 Eastern.
Yeah.
So, and that'll be 2 days, to be Thursday and a Friday.
Cool.
It'll be in February, so we got some time.
Yeah. Oh, cool. Nice idea.
Yeah, thanks. So, CSS Wizardry. So I guess you're good at styling.
Oh, yeah, I live with constant regret for picking that name. I was 17 years old and I bought the domain name CSS Wizardry because I thought it was cool or whatever. So yeah,
like JavaScript Ninja.
Exactly. And the worst thing is, I didn't even realize this until about 4 years ago. Harry the Wizard, it's been done before. So it's just, it plagues me. It's caught on too much, so I can't rebrand now. I'm too far in. So yeah, CSS Wizardry, it's probably the most immodest and childish company that was ever registered. But yeah, that's me.
And you were recommended, Rachel actually told us about you. I know like when I went to your Twitter, I saw that you have a extensive background in CSS, but I had said I was looking for somebody who had experience in developing large-scale CSS. So what's the importance of building CSS for performance at a large scale? What kind of bottlenecks have you encountered, and how do the browsers really look at these rules that we set?
To look at it in kind of two sort of different types of performance then. There's the kind of performance of how well will the product actually last as a code base, how long can we maintain it for, how long before we need to rebuild it. That's one thing, and because CSS is such a loose and well, frankly terrible syntax, managing it from a team point of view is a huge performance effort, right? So even before we start thinking about the network or like runtime performance, actually just making sure that a bunch of developers can contribute to a CSS code base that's a performance effort in itself. And that's because of a bunch of things. I think that out of every single language or syntax that your company will have in its stack, CSS is probably the only one that every single person will at some point modify, right? So you'll have designers, front-end developers obviously contributing to CSS. But you'll have software engineers and programmers, back-end developers, they'll need to do some CSS at some point. And because it is such a loose syntax, you can't write tests for it. It all operates globally. You get regressions, collisions. It's not very transparent. It's very declarative, so you don't really get a big picture view of what your CSS is doing. So that's why you end up with lots of duplication. People don't realize what's already available to them. Programming languages might have paradigms like MVC. So that means that developers would already know where to look for different things. CSS doesn't really have that, so people don't even know how to find existing bits of stuff. And in big companies, that obviously just gets magnified. A big company might have, I don't know, like up to 100 engineers contributing to the same code base for like 3 years.
And to be fair, when CSS was created, right, it was just meant as this global file that you would just put in, right? and everything would just be very flat, very simple. And now
Yeah, of
we've
course.
kind of expanded beyond that. I mean, we have stuff like even in web components, you can have shadow DOM with scope CSS, and it gets really crazy.
Yeah, exactly. If you look at the first web page, well, I mean, HTML itself just gives you an idea of, they were literally trying to style newspaper style documents, headlines, text, and you could really have an easy one-to-one mapping with that and the CSS. It was just a much simpler time. But now we've got apps, products, entire services. CSS it's actually impressive just how much CSS has managed to do for the last 18 years. We've pushed it pretty far. But like you say, that's why we're now having to introduce things like scope CSS via web components, or polyfills in the form of Polymer, or using CSS modules or React or anything like that to try and scope your CSS. They're all solutions to inherent problems with the language.
So we should just write all our CSS in JavaScript then. This is what I mean.
No.
But that's the new hotness, right? That's what we're doing.
It is, and I think that it does address a lot of valid problems. But I'm just really uneasy about. I mean, I've been doing this for like 10 years now, so I've kind of gone through the web standards movement. I saw the fight, to try and rip the styling out of HTML and get it in its own language. I just feel a bit hesitant to start stuffing it back into another language. I think web components proper, as in web components as per the spec, giving us shadow DOM and properly scoped CSS, that is going to be fantastic. It's going to be standardized. It's still going to be CSS. So I'm a little bit hesitant about putting our styling rules in a complete other language. We can't change our CSS without having to worry about changing JavaScript at the same time, or vice versa. So it kind of ties us into a bit of a monolith. But yeah, it's such a controversial. I was at a conference earlier this week, and I got the exact same question. Yeah, it's a very controversial subject right now.
I feel like it's.
I don't think it's.
It seems to be getting heated these days. That people seem to want to work in the one thing they sort of understand, and CSS can be difficult to understand. I mean, I think that's one reason that you see people going, "Well, I can do it like this then," and then I kind of understand that. But is there ways to make CSS a little bit more understandable?
Yeah, and it does take quite a lot of effort on the part of a CSS expert, for want of a better word. Solutions like writing your CSS in JavaScript usually come from very traditional software engineering type developers who don't know much about CSS, and because they think, like you say, in their current way of thinking, that to them might feel like the best solution. And I can completely understand why it's a terrible syntax. There's so many oddities and quirks with CSS. I found the best way to get people understanding CSS is to do the majority of the tricky work for them. This is what I normally do with companies. I will go in and I'll sort out architectural things. And I will sort of say, look, me and your front-end developers will build the tricky bits that you all hate. And from then on in, everything's going to be component-based. So you could go and use web components. You could go and use Polymer. You could even start using React. There are certain aspects of CSS that do need managing. Your global styles, for example. But everything after that point, we can make it really easy by just telling developers, well, look, you've chosen this as your view library. Write your CSS to pair it with that. But it doesn't. Yeah, it does take the input of a domain specialist in the first instance.
So we've seen the industry go back and forth on this quite a few times, because CSS came out and we're like, oh yes, we can now split our design into a separate file. But then Google came along and said, oh hey, we can get amazing performance improvement if we just like inline all of our CSS straight into the HTML and save all of those bits over the bandwidth. And then the industry went back to Sass and Compass and having everything separate and compile steps for CSS. And then, as Justin mentioned, we're kind of seeing a
have we lost you there?
We lost you there.
Oh no. Well, I can try and answer the questions so far. Well, I think our industry's got a huge problem with overcorrection as well. You see it all the time. We go from like, this is the current paradigm over here, and the pendulum swings to like the complete opposite. Like, oh, look at this new shiny, like everything we've been doing has been wrong, and let's do this version. And we do have this complete flip-flop of kind of overcorrection. I think our first attempt at separating concerns was a little less about maintenance and more about just making sure that we could disable CSS if we need to. So that was that was just moving away from font tags and style, like inline like color attributes, etc. So I think that was good. That was the correct decision. But then we did go completely CSS Zen garden and just completely leave everything out of the HTML. We have had this constant back and forth. But I think the way we're heading now is I want to think more about the maintenance aspect. I'm completely in favor of writing your CSS in Sass or less or post CSS, whatever you want to use. Just make sure it can compile out to a style sheet, so you've got your CSS in a separate technology from your view or whatever. But I completely agree with, let's stick that CSS back into the HTML. As long as a machine does that during a build step, it's not going to affect our ability to maintain that project, our ability to deconstruct the project, our ability to refactor just the view layer, perhaps. As long as a machine can munge it together and it still renders properly, I'm completely in favor of moving that CSS back into the HTML.
And there are a lot of tools that do that for you now. I mean, which is convenient. Over the years, we've sort of gained quite a few of them. Everything with a slightly different approach. I mean, is there any tool that you particularly like that sort of does that build step for you that you think does a pretty decent job?
I haven't experimented with, well, certainly not all of them. So of the ones I've used, uncss to strip unused CSS, just find out what the page actually needs. And then Filament Group's suite of tools, inline CSS and load CSS for asynchronously getting the rest of it. That's my kind of, my magic three.
Load CSS is pretty trick.
Second three?
Load CSS is pretty trick from Filament.
It's cool, right? It's really good.
Yeah, they did a real nice job on that.
The performance improvements you see are immediate as well. I think it's really good. One thing that does strike me as quite interesting is inlining our critical CSS is basically just a polyfill for server push coming in HTTP2. The whole point of inlining a critical CSS is so that the CSS and the HTML arrive at the exact same time, build your DOM and your CSS on, and have that in one round trip. As soon as we get the server push with H2, we can send the HTML and CSS as separate files, but at the same time. So we can completely remove the build step of actually identifying the CSS and inlining it. So we can do that kind of natively or through a standard as soon as HTTP2 or as soon as you adopt HTTP2.
And it's coming along. I know we've been testing it here to see sort of what the performance benefits are of sort of push in comparison to sort of inline and things like that, and it's looking very promising overall. So, as the stack has sort of gotten better, our ability to deliver to users has gotten way better, I think, overall from a CSS standpoint.
Yeah, it's really good that you're experimenting with it as well. A lot of my clients are a bit hesitant to start looking into H2 purely because the current best practices we've got now would make every website faster. Every browser faster. So the standards we have now would make IE faster, IE8 faster, for example. It would make Chrome faster, it would make Opera faster. The problem with H2 is it would make something like Chrome way faster, but it would end up making IE even slower. So switching over to H2 for a lot of people is going to take a long time. So it's really cool to hear that you're experimenting with it.
Yeah, I think you have to really weigh your case. Like, any sort of business case for building software or deploying any sort of technology is that you really sort of have to understand how people are actually using your thing right now. So if you have a lot of those sort of legacy 1-1 connections that you need, and you need to deliver those assets, you need that sort of build step. Then you need that inlining sort of event that's going to occur at some point in your process for rolling something out. A lot of things that we're experimenting with are serving two variations. So you're not purely serving H2. You're not using pure downgrade, which pure downgrade in that case is going to go, oh, well, I still need to load all these things, which is not going to give you the perf boost, which you just mentioned, right? You're going to end up with that horribleness of, oh my gosh, I got to load these things and I've hit my connect limit. There are, it's an experiment in process. Things are definitely picking up. We see, you know, at least we know we're moving people over to it as quick as we can for the cases that are low-hanging fruit for sure. Other ones are going to take a little bit more time, but we're going to get there. The web is improving as.
I think there's different challenges with HTTP 2. Sorry, there's some different challenges there. I mean, let's talk about that where you have HTTP 1.1. We're not going to get around that. We have to be able to serve backwards compatible. And when we had Paul Lewis on, he explained that you can do that because there's a header that's sent by the HTTP 2 browsers that will say, hey, if you want, serve me some HTTP 2, or you can have some HTTP 1. So we can do that. The thing is, when you optimize for this, you know, we've kind of, you know, you're from the beginning of CSS, so you know, like the CSS spriting techniques that we stole from, you know, different
game developers.
Developments. So there's build steps behind that. I remember when I started doing that, it was manual, right?
Yeah.
And it was crazy, and you had to optimize it because you couldn't have 25 images loading on a page. You could if you had the one, you take the hit once, it's cached, and then you could just reuse it. And to have these large, giant files is not really optimal for devices like mobile. And we didn't think about that back then. You know, now we have to think about it. So even HTTP 2, you know, we're finding too that you need like bundles still, but smaller bundles, right? That becomes another trick, right? Another thing we have to think about. I know Mark had some thoughts on HTTP 2.
Yeah, so I'm really excited about HTTP 2, but I, a month or 2 months ago, saw an article on Hacker News about a website that's pretty image heavy. When they used images that they base 64 into their CSS to deliver the page faster, they actually noticed with HTTP a slower connection or a slower latency, because what will end up happening is because it's all going through the same pipe, it has to happen sequentially. But if you loaded the HTML and just had the sources, and I know this is the point of HTTP 2, but HTTP 1 would wind up doing parallel requests for those images that actually loaded faster. So how do you address those things? Have you done much testing yourself on that?
Yeah. Base 64 it's always been an anti-pattern, unfortunately, because as we've learned more about the network and web performance has moved away from the browser and more toward the network layer, Base 64, it turns out, was always an anti-pattern. It causes fewer HTTP requests, which is traditionally seen as a good thing. But what you're often doing is you're moving non-critical assets onto a critical path. So an image that could have just downloaded as soon as it was ready now has to be coming over the wire the exact same time as your CSS. So all of a sudden, your images that were non-render blocking have been put into the render blocking pipeline. So yeah, Base 64 kind of always been an anti-pattern. I was working with a client literally today, like a few hours ago, and what I did is I did a little side-by-side comparison. They'd been Base 64ing a load of images. What I did is I got the compiled CSS, and in one I stripped every data Base 64 kind of inlining out of it. And that had a negligible difference. Over 160 some kilobytes of CSS, we saved 30, right? So 30 kilobytes of CSS. But then I minified both of them, and we got down to whatever size it was. I can't remember what it was. But again, the difference was negligible. But as soon as I gzipped them both, the one with no Base 64 whatsoever was 8.5 kilobytes, and the one with the Base 64 was 18. So you're talking like more than double the size, because Base 64 gzips terribly, because there's so little repetition in there. It doesn't gzip very well at all. So we'd realized that just Base 64ing a handful of images after gzip was causing the style sheet to more than double in size. So that's even just on H1, right? That's even old school kind of HTTP. But as you say, yeah, with H2, we get multiplexing, we can recycle connections. We should probably send 25 images separately. Cuts down on the build process of spriting. It means the style sheet's going to stay even smaller. Because yeah, CSS is render blocking, it's really important to keep our style sheets very small.
Okay,
so yeah, that was a really interesting discovery.
So the goal is you still write your code as if it's going to be loaded in parallel by the browser, but then you just leave it to HTTP 2 over the SQL network to optimize how to not choke its own bandwidth. So that way you get the performance improvements of HTTP2 and everything going over the same bandwidth, but it still then can intelligently decide how to handle that in a quote parallel situation. Okay, that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think there's, as a general rule, avoid base 64 wherever possible. Which then you get into interesting things like by avoiding base 64, we will improve performance. But what will also happen is we might make it more complex to package things up. So whereas you could have just had your icons inside your CSS, and now you've got to deploy, well, here's our icon set, and you need to use it with like this CSS here and implement it in your HTML this way. Performance is like, I just see it as like one giant game of whack-a-mole. As soon as you hit one thing, another one pops up somewhere else.
That's definitely a way to think about it. I want to get back to the team part of this too, because if you're a startup and you're using just straight up CSS, no tools or anything, you could probably get away with 100 lines of code of CSS for a small site. You could do some pretty good stuff, and you don't have to worry too much about the performance. But once you start scaling, once you start having like thousands of lines of code of just CSS that's repeated, and it gets really complex. So I've had this experience on a few different projects, and so what do you recommend as far as preparing for maintenance? What are some of the patterns or processes that you might use to deal with that, to reduce the technical debt moving forward?
So the scenario is that we've hacked together an MVP, maybe we've come together really quickly, and all of a sudden now we need to start looking after this thing and scaling it. So from there, what I normally recommend is try and stick with as much of your legacy CSS as you can. Right? It's no point rewriting. We want to tidy it up sequentially. So I'd just do a design audit. I'd go into the browser and I'd identify, we've got all this sprawling CSS. Let's imagine there was no kind of strategy whatsoever. What I would do is I would pick off, right, well, we can see that we've got this calendar widget, we've got this date picker, and I would just start trying to encapsulate these things and refactor them as standalone things. So I wouldn't get the entire CSS project and say, right, well, I need to tidy all of it up, because that's just going to take you weeks, and you're going to be out of, if you're in a startup especially, you can't really afford to spend weeks refactoring. So what I do is I just pick off fairly small scope tasks, like, well, today I'm going to encapsulate the nav, use a proper naming convention, make sure the nav just works. Tomorrow I could get back delivering features, or tomorrow I could pick another bit of UI and refactor that. So I just tend to go through and just isolate small parts of the project we could tidy up relatively quickly, and just rinse and repeat until we've got most of it done.
The other part of that too, though, is that you may have, at a startup, you may have 2 or 3 people touching the CSS code, but once you start scaling, you might have 10, 15, I've worked on a team that's, close to 30 people, and they're all touching the Fast and the CSS, and, it becomes a maintenance nightmare. And you start seeing stuff like random style attributes, and people adding, grid _17, like exclamation mark important everywhere, like in line even.
Obviously, those things are important. They're very
obvious.
Imperative.
So how do you deal with that as far as like, I guess, like rounding everybody in and saying, here's what we need to do with the CSS as a team. When you're in the code, you do X, Y, and Z. Like, how does that look?
This is always a really difficult one. There are immediate, like, short-term things you can put in place to take the edge off. But unfortunately, what it will eventually need is a cultural, appreciation of the fact that if I'm going to write CSS, I need to do a good job of it. I think because CSS has traditionally been kind of seen as fairly simple, a lot of people don't want to spend the time learning it properly. But in the immediate term, put linting in place, get linters in there to make sure people aren't doing really easy to catch things, naming conventions, make sure they're correct, etc. Make sure we're not using IDs, as CSS. So really kind of, low-hanging fruit, I guess. So start there, programmatically find things that people are doing wrong. And then over enough time.
a pattern that I use and a couple other people that I've heard in the industry recommend, and I want you to critique it. So I've moved more into property-based CSS, where I have classes that only have one or two properties inside of them. And a lot of times I'll just be like, well, the blue class, which sets the background to any element to be blue. And then I'll have like a panel class or a nav class. So then in my HTML, I just kind of tag my element into the sort of thing I want. I want it to be a blue modal panel.
Mm-hmm.
And do you recommend that? Is that a good idea? Is that a bad idea? It's very counter cascading because it's property based.
Yeah. I mean, it's the classic kind of composition over inheritance model. I am not anti it. I haven't implemented it on any projects myself. My only reservation with it is in large teams, one, you have to have everyone memorizing what these classes are. It's much harder to remember a string of like magic combination of classes than it is to remember like nav primary, for example. And also, when you've got that string of classes in your markup, it's a lot harder to decipher what's going on. Sometimes you can't tell, well, I've got 8 classes here now. Are these two related? If I copy and paste this somewhere else, do I need to take this class with it or any of that stuff? But then on the flip side, the benefit is tiny style sheets, less need for anyone to go into the style sheets. So it means that you're less likely to get sort of bad CSS contributed. So I do feel like it definitely has relative pros and cons. It's got merits either side. It's not something I've implemented, and I would be quite hesitant to implement it. But I'm glad that people out there are looking into it. I'm glad that people are stress testing it. I think in a couple more years, we'll have a little more data on whether it was successful or not. And I think we'd be more informed when that time comes.
Yeah, it's definitely got pros and cons. So there's another developer here that I work with who's also very passionate about CSS. And he has done a really good job at doing something similar to this, where he has classes that do one thing, and he applies them to the components, and then he just gives the components to the developers. So it's interesting. I had a lot of pain doing a lot of work with Bootstrap and other things where you add, like 3 or 4 classes, and then your markup starts to look like, the color dash blue dash layout dash whatever. It starts to really add to that. I think that you could get some really good performance as far as the file sizes, because gzipping and everything with HTML. But for maintenance reasons, it's really frustrating to me. But I look at what he's done, and he's done a really good job. So I'm kind of like torn, because I'm more of like thinking forward of, we're building separate components to share across, our applications. I want an imperative library that I started building internally here that I can use like BEM syntax and just take stuff that's like, variables that are consistent and pass that in. And I get high performance classes. One class will have this stuff, but it's a tool for component development, not for application development.
Yeah.
So there's a difference there.
Yeah, there definitely is. I mean, I think the performance benefit is measurable, right? Tiny style sheets composing all these classes. There is a definite performance benefit. The maintenance aspect, you have to put all these. You're just spreading a lot of complexity through your view layer now. For me, that doesn't concern me too much, because you should be drying out your views just as much as you're drying out your other code, right? So you should have a sensible template or view library setup. So you shouldn't be doing too much manual work there. I've always tried to hold a bit of a personal kind of philosophy of, you should never just dismiss anything because it feels icky. It's far too subjective. So I could have easily written off the many classes, like single use classes like pad 6 and blue. One could easily write that off as just being icky, but the people experimenting with it are making compelling cases. So I think it does deserve some attention.
Yeah, I mean, same thing can be said for React's inline, where you have like, and not just React, but like, I think Khan Academy has a library as well that does this. But that performance that you get for having it like style equals whatever,
I don't
is significant.
my previous question came through because my internet crashed out. But that's what I was asking, how the industry seems to have gone back and forth, back and forth, back and forth over the last couple of decades. So.
Yeah, we kind of discussed that while you were sort of battling internet. Yeah, we keep flip-flopping. We've got this huge tendency for overcorrection. I think we need to find like the comfortable middle ground and sort of set sail in a straight line for a few years. Actually, see where that gets us.
That leads to an interesting question. I get most of my news from Hacker News. There's a really interesting article about other competing standards for styling back in the 90s, and CSS wound up winning. I don't know if you know about all the different ones. I don't know enough. But do you know about those competing standards that existed back then? Or even if you don't, what would have been the ideal styling format that we should have gone to from your experience?
I think
CSS a mistake?
I don't think CSS was a mistake. I think it was appropriate for the time. And the problem when you work on the web, you've got a long tail of legacy, right? So I think that if we could, we would rewrite CSS and say, let's deprecate these features, let's introduce this. But obviously, we can't just have that kind of wholesale overhaul. I know there was JSS, so there was an attempt by Netscape, I think, to write everything in JavaScript back in the 90s. I don't think the CSS was a mistake, but I think if we'd have designed it properly, we would have introduced scoping, would have introduced true encapsulation that Web Components is now 18 years later, trying to achieve. One of the beautiful things about CSS is that it was designed to have a very low barrier to entry. The reason so many people can be web developers is because it is so easy to learn. People can hack around, people can pick this stuff up. So I think from that point, from that kind of standpoint, I'm glad that it's a simple syntax. It would just be nice if we had like a strict mode that we could enable and then use some really cool features for building web applications and sort of try and leave, or like choose to deprecate a bunch of the CSS spec ourselves.
Interesting. That is a fascinating.
Like things like, because I just wish there are two things in CSS which are completely at odds with each other. Well, maybe even three, right? Inheritance defines how things trickle down. It's heavily source order dependent. So whatever you write last is what gets applied, except if you chose a selector with a certain specificity. So like you've got one model which is completely source order defined, but then just by using a higher specificity selector up here, you can invert that model. And it seems like all of CSS is just fighting itself. It is a surprisingly complex paradigm when you think about all the different ways you can undo things or inadvertently regress things.
Yeah, it's interesting to me too. Like, with people who are not familiar with how the browser interprets the CSS, they'll do longer selectors, right? And something like Sass, I've talked about this before, or even less, or any of them that nest things, they encourage you to do this. So you can use it very to your advantage by using, concatenation of strings, like so you could do like BEM syntax and do it that way. But what happens is the browser has to go backwards from your selector, right? It parses it backwards, so it's going to find all these things here inside of this. So it has to do these really intensive things, and that's I think why when CSS and Smax and things came out, everybody's going one selector, and I think that's the great way to do it. You do one selector, and then the selector type wars. I don't know what they're really called, but it sort of makes it easier to override those things.
It almost gets rid of the problem, doesn't it?
Yeah, to a degree. I mean, there's always going to be, sometimes you have integration with other CSS on your page, that you're sharing, and maybe they don't really care about CSS like you do, and so
that happens a lot.
Yeah, like important is everywhere again, and things like that start to happen in the project.
Yeah. I think the length of selectors thing is quite an interesting thing to study. If anyone wants to kind of level up their CSS, first place they need to start is their selectors. Steve Souders many years ago made a tool for measuring how slow CSS selectors were, and those many years ago, nesting selectors was by far the slowest because, as you say, you check the very far right part of the selector, and then decide, well, does it match? Yeah, okay. Does the next bit match? Until it goes all the way back up. Super expensive. Those performance issues don't affect us today in 2016. We're very unlikely to hit selector performance issues, but we should still keep those selectors short for a number of reasons. Like you say, keeping specificity nice and low. It makes your styles more transportable. If you've got a heavily nested thing, that means it has to match 12, or like 10 or 12 different certain points in that selector before it will render. By keeping selectors nice and short, keep specificity low, keep CSS nice and portable, and a happy accident is selectors are going to be faster.
It makes it easy to understand what it does too. Like if you just have one single name, semantically it'll be better, and you'll have less stuff in your markup.
I'm going to jump back to what Eric mentioned at the beginning of his last question, which is how the browser interprets. So lately I've been seeing a lot of work on Mozilla's Servo rendering engine. I think they're using Rust language underneath. And I saw a really impressive demo where he said, we've basically removed all of the bottleneck from CSS rendering, how the browser actually puts things out on to the screen. And I guess, is it possible that a lot of these performance bottleneck questions in terms of just how the browser actually paints going to be taken away from us and solved by future better rendering engines? I know a few years back, people are probably more familiar with Famous. I don't know what happened to it. I think it kind of exploded on itself, but they use the transform to put everything on the GPU, and things rendered really fast, like actual performance. So what are your thoughts on those things?
So part of me feels it's weird that a front-end developer has to know about CPU versus GPU and hardware acceleration. That feels like something the browser should take care of. And they are getting clever, right? Browsers do a lot to help us. We can do things that completely ruin that. We could do really, really bad things, animating with JavaScript, for example. And the browser can't do much to speed that up. But I think you're right. I think a lot of these decisions will, and certainly should, be taken more toward the browser. It seems bizarre that if I want to move something from left to right, I also need an in-depth knowledge of hardware acceleration, how to force something to be hardware accelerated. So yeah, I really do hope that the browser vendors are going to start taking a little more responsibility for that.
But at the same
I'd be really
time,
interested.
See, my problem with that, though, is that this goes to sort of how the Extensible Web Manifesto sort of existed and why it came to be, right? Why did we sort of move away from black box solutions to do things in the web? Because from a primitive standpoint, if you don't have the primitives, you can't sort of build the more advanced things that you need. So if we move to that model where I don't need to understand necessarily how things paint, why do dev tools now have style recalculation in them, right? It's because it's trying to teach us from a development standpoint that these things do indeed matter. And that while we can make some things simpler, like knowing things like will change and the sort of properties that are going to give us the most performance across the board, purely black boxing them and saying, don't worry, you don't have to worry about this anymore, seems to me nice for probably a wide swath of developers, but at the same time, that terrifies me. Because if you sit there and you black box and you say, don't worry about how any of this stuff works anymore, then I question that. I question that approach.
Before you reply, I'm going to jump in. I'm going to say I'm on Justin's side here because this is how we got in the danger with IE6 being a huge monopoly in the first place, right? Back in the day, everybody had to conform to IE6 standard. And while I would love the browsers to just solve these problems for us, there does seem to be a really bad trust issues with the authorities out there that have these open source viewers, the browsers.
Well, so I'm not suggesting that we should close source things. Merely all I'm saying is that should I need to know about a 3D transform hack to make the browser run faster? Shouldn't the browser be able to hardware accelerate itself? But I'm not saying that people should be ignorant of these things. I'm glad that I know about hardware acceleration. I'm glad that I can delve deeper. And in fact, the browsers already are starting to black box certain things for us. Everything you see in Chrome's DevTools, for example, has the sort of original, like, very like engineer hacky kind of version of it behind a flag somewhere. I don't know if you've seen Chrome's about tracing. It's basically the rendering timeline in your dev tools, but completely on steroids, and it's a much more like detailed view of things. So to an extent, they already are starting to kind of save us from a lot of this hassle. But I certainly don't think people should be ignorant of it. I'm just saying that, certain things I feel like the browser should be able to do for us.
I think it's more that we should be aware of it, right? We should be aware that things happen this way. We don't need to fully understand the details of it. But I mean, now we have things like CSS keyframes, right? That are becoming more and more available in the browsers. I think it's up to like 90-something% if you don't include older IE. And that's like that's pretty amazing because we haven't had a lot of that. And then you have WebGL, like you were saying, using the GPU. So I mean, I guess it's just kind of like we should know these things are there because we can directly affect them for better or for worse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think a good example would be Boxshadow. It's a fully spec'd CSS property, but it's terrible for rendering performance. I think a developer should be able to use Boxshadow and not have to worry about this is bad for rendering performance, because the browser should make allowances for that. The browser should be the one that says, okay, you're using Boxshadow, I'm going to put this on the GPU for you. And that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. Still knowing that the GPU is there and you can use it, you could trick it, you could trick things into being on there if you need to, is valuable knowledge to have. But I do think that, if a developer is going to build a page as per the design and it has a lot of box shadows on and all of a sudden it runs slowly and they have to go through and put each one of those things on the GPU, it would be nice if the browser was just like, yeah, let's just do that for you.
Now, going back to some of the things like you mentioned, Mark, about browsers specifically like IE6 and getting browser compatibility. One of the things that I found difficult throughout the years is, and it's getting much, much better now, is getting that cross-browser compatibility, because CSS is fickle mostly because of the different implementations. And it's great that we have these different implementations to Mark's point. But I mean, debugging CSS can be an issue, especially in older IE or mobile Safari, older mobile Safaris, and dealing with developer tools that can help us a lot more now. How can we sort of find these things? Because there's things that are rarely documented in old IE, like IE8 I've talked about, where it cuts off CSS mid-file once it reaches a certain kilobyte, right? And that could be in the middle of a rule. It doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. So like there's no, like in JavaScript, if you get a runtime error, it throws an error, right? In CSS, it just ignores it. So what are the tools that you recommend and processes for approaching CSS issues in the browsers?
Yeah, do you know what? Having that question phrased like that makes it really starkly aware just how bad things are. Because I mean, if a lot of this knowledge only becomes, or you only get it from being battle hardened, I guess. Like you say, you have to be aware of the 4096 selector limit in IE, otherwise you're going to be confused for days. Yeah, so I think things.
And I was.
Yeah, it's crazy, isn't it? It's an awful, awful, weird little thing to happen. There are certain things like turning on debugging style sheets, so actually putting borders around bits of HTML if they are nested funny, or you can write, I was actually working on it this afternoon, little debugging libraries where you can say, if this element exists outside of this context, throw a red border around it. So it's almost like writing tests for your CSS. And it's not about using tools to find it. It's about having someone who knows to check for them, who could do that work for the team, perhaps. But yeah, browser quirks also, to just basically repeat what you said, we're getting a lot luckier now. The browsers are standardizing. We don't have to remember 2 different box model variations. I think that new developers coming to CSS will have to worry a lot less about cross-browser inconsistencies.
So one of the things too that to move on a little bit, I'll use like the timeline I'm starting to use now in Chrome for debugging. I'll also use, back in the day we had very few things for IE. There was like some IE emulators. I mean, we talked about this with Brian Cardell because he's had extensive experience debugging the entire web, and it's been interesting to see like now we have a lot more tools. I think the one place where the tooling is not as good is in mobile, right? And it's getting much better because we still have to emulate a lot. Like we have in Chrome and Firefox, they have the mobile emulators, but those will only go so far. Testing on actual devices is something that's very helpful, but then, what's happening on there? Well, now you have to hook up whatever native debugger to that to get like an accurate read out of that. Are there tools that you recommend for mobile that are, halfway decent?
Yeah, I think
or
there's
even
no
approaches to processes even, I don't know.
Yeah, so I would say, as far as tools are concerned, Safari, debugging Safari on an iPhone through Safari on a desktop is actually a really pleasurable experience. You plug your iPhone into your laptops, or your machine, that's quite nice. And it's same with Chrome on Android, in Chrome on your desktop, so the remote debugging there is pretty good. Apart from the weird thing where you've got to tap the serial number 7 times to enable developer mode on an Android phone. Don't know if anyone's done that before. So I think, yeah, like you said, the tooling is getting better, but emulators are fine, but there's no replacement for real devices, right? Using real devices is always going to be the best thing you can do. But there's a huge barrier to entry with that because a lot of companies don't want to spend thousands on setting up a device. Like, they're not cheap things to set up. So you need to get the approval for a decent array of devices, the cash to buy all those, somewhere to put them all. The added overheads of running.
You also need the metrics too to get like at least in larger companies, you'll need to prove out that we need X device and Y device and Z device.
Yeah.
Because so you need to look at your logs and figure out how many people are using these devices. If you have people like 5 people out of 5,000 using IE9, there's no reason you should spend an entire sprint working on IE9 bugs.
Oh, completely. Like, yeah. Terrible spend of money. But yeah, one actual quite amusing story from like when I worked. So it's about 3, maybe 4 years ago. I was working with a company, and they were building a full M.dot website. They had a corporate network that was heavily locked down, so they weren't allowed Wi-Fi anywhere in the building. Everything had to be a wired connection. So on a wired connection, you couldn't get from your mobile phone to localhost on your machine. You couldn't expose it to the network. So the entire mobile testing process was resizing Chrome or Firefox, then rolling a release to staging, which means that if you want to check how your dev site actually looked on your real device in your pocket, you've got to roll a release, wait till that's live, check it there. And you realize it needs to be 5 pixels to the left. It's like, well, bring it back 5 pixels, wait until a release gets rolled, check it there. It was absolutely just an awful way of working. So a guy I know actually built a tool which securely exposes localhost. He built it for us to use. He built it for us to get around this problem. So it securely exposes localhost to the internet over HTTPS. You can view the site from any device, like a smart fridge, your phone on GPS, whatever, GPRS. And that's actually become a full-time product for him now. He actually productized it, and it was actually like, in a weird, perverse way, a huge win for him. It's a tool that's freely available. It hasn't been open sourced, but it's freely available. Put a link to it in the show notes because it's an incredible bit of kit.
So speaking of that, if something's not working on Internet Explorer 9 or something's not working on the latest phone, to me that's suggesting that the user's experience is dependent upon the CSS. And this gets into the discussion of whether you should be using CSS to do layout or not. I'm in the progressive enhancement camp, so I would argue by default the experience should work no matter what devices. Even a refrigerator, as you mentioned, can access the site, and then you incrementally advance on top of that. But now we're starting to mix in some JavaScript. And then the question of, well, do we leave the layout to be rendered using only CSS? Some of those features aren't available in newer browsers. How do you go about this? What's your take?
Well, first of all, amen to the progressive enhancement thing. Really appreciate hearing that. I'm with you all the way. Layout itself is a feature. It's an enhancement. The way I tackle this is kind of almost like not my fault, not my problem, right? So if a designer was to provide me with a design where something as fundamental as the layout is going to be hard to achieve cross-browser or for the browsers we need to support, I would go back and say, look, we need to design around this. We've got this kind of problem of the fundamental layout of the site is going to be hard to achieve in one of the browsers we need to lay this site out in. We've already dropped the ball, right? That's already a misfire. Example I would use would be from about, well, a few years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, using position fixed in mobile browsers was just really difficult. And then you'd have to use JavaScript to polyfill it, and that had its kind of performance downsides. Every team I worked on who was trying to use position fixed on mobile, my answer was just, look, design around not needing. Just redesign it where we don't need position fixed. It's too fundamental to try and hack it. We need a solution that doesn't need it at all. I'm with you, progressive enhancement. Yeah, I would like to leave layout as close to CSS as possible. Using variations on slight things, like we could use Flexbox but drop back to display table in older browsers. Things like that is fine, but if it's a fundamental layout issue, back to the drawing board. Start again with the design.
Jen Simmons actually has a really good article about falling back on CSS for layout, and she talks about how you shouldn't do supports, and then doesn't support this. You should have like a base CSS that it'll fall back to, and then you have supports. So we really, there is some movement towards that. But she had a really good article on that. I'll try and link that in the show notes.
Yeah, she's real smart. She's real clever. I think I may have seen the same article, nodding along with it.
Really quickly, since this is tangentially related, what are your thoughts on things like Grid CSS? It is a product that I think came out a year or two ago. I don't know if you heard about it. Tries to emulate iOS type
it was
layout.
Constraints and stuff by using GCSS, yes. I think. Yeah. Yes. To answer you completely honestly, I didn't look into it. I didn't use it. I didn't experiment with it. So yeah, I don't have.
I guess compared to then, have you done any iOS development and used the layout and tools there? So how would you compare?
I haven't. I'm afraid. Okay. I haven't. But yeah, I don't know if I would be interested to hear your thoughts on it. Actually, considering I'm a complete noob, so if you wouldn't mind briefing me on it.
I haven't actually used them either, which is
okay. Maybe that's our homework.
Well, that died quickly.
I'd comment, but it's
nice.
I don't understand. Every time I see something that pops up, I'm like, look, it's like other platform X. I go, because I wonder what the thought. I always wonder what the thought process is. Like, were you stuck using that tool and you started to really like it, and you're like, I bet that will work for X, and then you did
Stockholm syndrome.
Yeah, you just sort of start writing a whole bunch of stuff, and you're like, yeah, it's magic, and then you're like, that doesn't work like on half that stuff, or this doesn't like what was. It intrigues me more than anything else. I think
this
it's
is
right
the
or wrong.
best thing since. Wait a minute, this is the only thing I've ever used.
Well, like we were talking about, right? That pendulum Swift. Hotness over here, must use now, which I've heard this guy on this podcast before talk about just his dislike of that. I think that was me. So, not a huge fan of the let's move to the new thing tomorrow thing.
Yeah.
There's 2 more topics I really want to cover. I know we're running against time here, but as far as like doing continuous integration and continuous deployment, it sounds like it shouldn't be an issue with CSS, but I've encountered it too where if there's developer operations maybe that's not so familiar with things that you're using, like Sass, and then they have to install Ruby on the machines. Like there's linters that will run on the different CI devices and different testing for CSS. Even stuff like Huxley to test for image pixels in certain positions.
Mm-hmm.
Like, how do you approach that to let those teams know kind of what they need to do?
What to expect? Well, it's so funny you mentioned this, because my answer to the question, how do you approach teams to let them know, is that I famously once didn't. I was working for a company full time. We were building quite a very large application. And I just decided that from kind of the beginning, I'm going to build this one on SAS. This was about 5-6 years ago. So I was like, I'm going to use SAS. And I was the lead front end, so I could make that decision. So I started using pre-processors for everything. And it wasn't until we started having to roll releases that someone asked, so, where's the CSS file? I was like, oh, it's SAS. And this was at a time when the only compiler for SAS was written in Ruby. And the DevOps engineers were furious with me. They were absolutely furious because the entire stack didn't have a drop of Ruby in it. And all of a sudden now, because of front-end developers just completely not thinking to mention it, the CI servers needed Ruby installing, which brought with it its own like version problems. The developers so I built the initial framework, the CSS framework for the project. Any other developer who needed to contribute had to be able to compile SAS. So I had to go and tell the developers and say, like, you need to install Ruby for this, I'm afraid. And I had to do little workshops on how SAS worked. And since that day, I have learned the importance of do not introduce anything to your platform without talking or asking your DevOps engineers. Yeah, I messed up on that one almost famously.
I think that's I don't think that is unusual, to be honest. I mean, when you talk about integrated anything in the DevOps chain of CI things, like that's not a particularly simple thing to do. It's at any scale, small or large. Introducing anything is, that little fine grained sort of things that you end up having to do to make sure that it just works right. So yeah, I feel you there.
Yeah, there's other things like the exact same company had an interesting thing. Like you said, you wouldn't think CSS would affect your CI, right? You think it's such an innocent, small, trivial part of the stack. The exact same company ran into the 4096 selector problem, and they had to do something very weird to combat it, because what they had to do is they had to get their CI environment to chop the style sheet in half before they could deploy to IE. And because this is all done in CI, it could easily get the assets, it could easily get the full compile style sheet and split that in two. But then what they ended up doing is, instead of rewriting the view to have two link tags for part A and part B, what they did is they put an @import rule in the top of the first style sheet, which requested the second one, which led to enormous performance bottlenecks. Downloading hundreds of kilobytes of CSS, the first few hundred kilobytes gets over the wire, starts being parsed and executed, and then immediately the browser has to stop. It can't paint anything, it can't render anything, it has to go off and get the other few hundred kilobytes. So this one tiny 4096 selector limit had a knock-on effect, the CI environment, which in turn had a knock-on effect with the performance for every single visitor to that site. @import in CSS is an absolute performance killer. And yet that was all born of one weird IE bug and a CI environment that couldn't modify the HTML and had to do all the chopping and changing directly in the CSS files.
And I think, I hear stories like that, and it always, to some extent, it always makes me chuckle, because I've seen issues like that myself over the years. You work enough in it and you're like, wow, that is a bizarre thing that we introduced by just... What commit did it? Oh, it was that one commit where I added one more selector. I can't do one thing at the end, and then you're like, it doesn't work anymore. And then
you tell the product owner that you have to operate a first in, first out rule. Like, well, if we need to add a new button, we need to take something else out from the top.
Yeah, exactly.
This is why I think, as a junior developer, and I certainly did this as a junior developer, I would come along and I would see things like that, and I'd be like, oh, these people are so stupid, they don't know what they're doing. This is terrible. And a senior engineer looks at that and thinks, something crazy happened here. With age comes that kind of, they must have done this for a reason, right? There's something weird that happens somewhere down the line.
Yeah, there is always a story. And the kicker is that the one thing people forget to do is ask. If you're like, I wonder why this is, there was probably a reason. And it was probably not everybody was happy with necessarily, but it had to be done. because sometimes you have to
exactly.
ship something, and ideally you don't impact performance like that. With add import, I mean, talk about worst case scenarios of like a tumbleweed effect.
Exactly. It's bizarre.
Yeah, bizarre. Like you couldn't have called it if you wanted to. Like that was in no one's plan. So you roll with the punch, and then you try to figure out how you're going to make these disparate pieces sort of function together. But yeah, I always tell the juniors who sort of come in, if you don't understand, just ask, because there's probably a really good story that you'll learn something about later on.
Yeah.
That you too will tell your friends, and then hopefully everyone learns a little bit of something about how much fun engineering is.
Yeah, it's all WD-40 and sticky tape all the way down.
It's a quick question. It's tangentially related, but web fonts, what's your take on it? Because I typically import web fonts with import statements.
Yeah, so web fonts, I mean, they're good. They're good news. They're nice. I would probably just put link elements in the HTML because, yeah, at import is a huge performance bottleneck. So use web fonts. Use link tags in the HTML to import the style sheets for them. But then, yeah, there are more refined ways of doing things. Like, we've got Typekit. I've got some people like Typekit, font service providers. They've got nice asynchronous ways of loading the fonts in.
Block
there's low-level API.
Block content rendering until the font is loaded, or always display content and then have the flash?
Have the flash. Definitely have the flash. I've got a I kind of stopped doing it because it was too frequent. But every time I try load a page on my phone and there's just a missing font for like 18 seconds, I will screenshot it. And I had a library of, look how many sites think that their brand typeface is more important than their content. It's just a bizarre. I find it really odd that the only person who cares about your custom typeface is you, basically.
Well, and the study shows that too, right? I mean, people leave when they don't see that paint. Like it's better at this point to make sure you're displaying something to your end user, as opposed to, like you said, waiting for the typeface you so much love. Your user doesn't care. They want the thing they came for.
Yeah. Well,
typography affects the look and feel so much too, though.
Well, this is the thing. I'm conflicted because I love typography. Typography is my guilty pleasure, right? It's the thing that if I could design, I'd probably be a typographer. I absolutely love type, but I love performance more. I'd rather have something quickly that's ugly than get something in 2 minutes that's beautiful. And it's a constant trade-off. But yeah, so this thing, are you? What kind of paradigm would you take? Would you take the web fonts are important, or what's the kind of opposite?
I don't know who you're asking specifically.
Oh, it's kind of almost a response, because you kind of started discussing the flip side of it, and that typography does hugely affect the look and feel. So I'm interested to just hear the.
I would definitely. I mean, the Google CDN is great, but if you can't have if you have a custom font, like you said, I definitely would host that on a CDN. Definitely have some caching strategy for that. Definitely use it for body content, right? Headers. Don't use it. Don't have like 20 different fonts.
That's the key thing, right?
You want 1 to 2 fonts. And there's the problem is too. A lot of them have different variants, right? So just know what you're using, and you should only have 2 like fonts for legibility, right?
Yeah.
In general.
No, that's the thing.
You can have an icon font too.
Yeah. I agree with you. Web fonts I use web fonts on my site, right? I think it's easier to design nice things if you've got better typographical palette available. And I really like that Google do have like a odometer of this is going to be really slow. So people are aware of what they're getting into.
Yeah, and the problem with the Google fonts is not that it's not great. It's just not all of the fonts, like if you're a designer, you're quickly going to notice that everything is Lotto, everything is Roboto, and sans serif fonts, to be fair, are great for the web. They're much easier to read on a screen, and there's really good ones there. But then you start to see this site looks like that site, and that site looks like this site. We should really do an episode on typography at some point. it's not like a subject that people get all excited about, like React inline styles,
Mhm.
but it is one of the more important things for a web page. If you're
Well,
delivering content, I should say.
Well, there's work on it too, like in terms of the way browsers render it. The font loading API sort of in the works these days. You can sort of play with it. I think it's under development. I think in most. I think it's in Chrome and Firefox now, which can sort of really optimize how you handle fonts and do things. So it is important. Otherwise, we wouldn't be having this conversation, and there wouldn't be articles and APIs being developed around it. But there is, again, with a lot of sort of delivering something to someone, there are trade-offs, and I think everyone has to sort of gauge what the trade-off for them is going to be. Is that load performance? Is that render performance? What is important to me? And if you have data that you're sort of collecting analytics-wise about user timings and the sort of things that actually happen, not just the things that we assume happen, then we can make choices that, affect the way that we write the styles, load the fonts, do the things that we need to do to deliver that experience to end users.
No.
I know that we are over time now, so I do want to be respectful of that. There's a couple of topics I wanted to cover if we have some time, but if we have to go, we should wrap it up here, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I'm free for a little longer. If we've got a couple more things to discuss, I'm happy to hang out a little more. It's up to you guys.
Okay, I can stay on. As far as we talked a little bit about inline styles and React and things like that. One of the things I'm encountering now that I started using React even, I'm not doing inline styles, but I am doing stuff like with Webpack, and I had a question like how do you see using file loaders like with Webpack and other file loaders and service workers to cache and do strategies on that? How do you see that fitting in with CSS?
So I haven't actually used Webpack personally myself. Service Worker is amazing. Service Worker is huge. The performance wins as just kind of that on its own is going to be enormous. But file loaders are going to be really important because or very useful. With H2, we can multiplex, so we don't need to send one CSS file over the wire. We can send like 25, which means that we can have more granular caching strategies. It means that we could send header.css, reset.css, videoplayer.css as individual files. Reset.css, we're never going to change that. So there's no point sort of invalidating the cache of one big CSS file for the sake of a color change in a button. So I think things like file loaders or things like that will become more useful for CSS purely because we can have more granular caching strategies. That's something that people should be keeping an eye on.
Okay. I was worried initially with something like Webpack because I saw like the load times and I'm like, oh my God, this is crazy. And then someone showed me, oh, no, you're building for development. Now just build for prod here. And I'm like, holy, like the difference is night and day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
so it's very interesting. So I'm interested to see how that works. As far as like service workers go, I mean, that's a worker that lives outside of the DOM. So you can do like strategies to load not just your CSS, but other assets as well. And the service workers is cool, except you can't really depend on it in the browsers. You shouldn't depend on it either for progressive, enhancement reasons, which we talked about with the episode of Paul Lewis as well. Because I was saying, you could just Babelify inside of your service worker and do all this other stuff. But bottom line is that you can't count on that for something that's core to your application.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah. Resilience all the way through, right? But when service worker is there and it is working, it's just incredible. It's such an exciting technology.
Yeah, it's incredible. It is. So I have one last topic before we get going. This is really something I've been struggling with in my career for a little while now, and I think we're making headway as a community. But in different companies, it's a little different. How important is it to work closely with UX or creative teams to create style guides, to have consistency, because that can affect performance and maintenance to a large degree in projects.
You're completely right. I mean, I think you just summed up my thoughts exactly. Performance starts in Sketch, performance starts in Photoshop, performance starts with design. I work with a lot of teams who are kept well away from their designers, and they often ask me, right, we've been given these designs, how do we make a nice modular UI toolkit out of them? So, well, it hasn't been designed in a modular fashion. It hasn't been designed to be a mass-produced toolkit. We're fitting a square peg into a round hole here, and it is very difficult. So I echo your sentiments. The performance starts at the design stage. It's imperative that people need to, the design and development teams need to work in tandem.
And like, do you feel that some groups are more of like, let's throw this over the wall? It's done, here's the desktop mockups for you developers, and now we're going to go do our mobile mockups, and you guys go work on that. I mean, this has been the case with a lot of companies I've been at.
I think
how do you kind of make that communication easier?
So I think there are a few things. I think the problem normally stems from very traditional companies. So either traditional agencies who are like client services companies, they'll have a design department and a dev department, and it'll be the designer who goes to the meetings with the project manager, and the developer's the last person to hear about anything. I think that's, well, frankly, I mean, this is basic disrespect. Like, it's treating developers like you'll do what we tell you, here's your designs, go and build them. And it also stems from very traditional companies who may have had marketing departments. Whereas a small startup, you're all in it together. But a large corporate will have, well, here's the marketing team. They did the print material, so they're doing the website as well. And again, you've got this very kind of separated thing. First thing I do is, and also in these kind of companies, you'll have engineers who work in rapid development cycles, or you'll have a more waterfall design process. First thing I try and do is just get at least one designer in that scrum, get one designer sat with the engineers, doing their design work, even if they're not talking with the engineers for 80% of the day. Make sure they're sat with the engineers so the engineers could lean over and say, hey, I'm building this bit of the thing you designed. It's quite tricky. Can we rework it together in the browser? Huge benefits. That only costs you a small organizational overhead. Just get your designer to sit somewhere else, or get your designer integrated into the scrum. You don't need a full top-down reorg for that kind of stuff. You don't need to rethink your entire design strategy. Just get your designers and developers just sat pairing together.
So Harry, let's end on the last question of, what do you think is the future of CSS? Do you think we'll evolve and go beyond CSS, that we'll start seeing custom WebGL, Canvas browsers inside of the browsers that have their own design language? What do you think is the future that the industry should be looking out for in the next 10, 20 years?
Wow. I think the future is going to be, we're exposing much more granular low-level things across the entire platform. So the future of CSS is going to be these tiny modules that can evolve separately to everything else, right? So we've stopped having monolithic specifications for CSS. So it means we can start picking new things and running with them. There are things like Houdini, which I haven't actually, this is pretty shameful, I haven't actually looked into Houdini much at all. But I think we're starting to realize that CSS does have a lot of shortfalls. We are leveling up pretty quickly. So the low-level APIs, the low-level things we're exposing means that, it puts a lot more power in the engineer's hands to build much more complex applications. Kind of goes back to what was said way at the beginning, I guess, how being aware of the very low-level things puts a lot of the flexibility in the hands of the people building for the web. So I'm quite excited just to know that browsers are exposing a lot of low-level stuff.
Yeah, Houdini is pretty exciting. I mean, you've got pretty much everyone sort of chipping into that in terms of what the CSS engine looks like. And it's still in a draft, and they're working on sort of defining what the worklets sort of look like in terms of painting and animation and those sorts of things. But that is sort of really exciting, I think, in terms of basically being able to say, well, I don't have a selector, I don't have a property for this thing that I want to style with things like Houdini and the worklets and sort of the primitives that they would offer, you could define your own to do that paint. And that's, to me, that would be amazingly awesome.
Yeah, I think I speak for all of us. Say again?
It would be magical.
It would be. I think I probably speak for all of us, given the title of this podcast, that we want the web to win, right? We want the web to be a success. So I think, we're going to see the web really, really starting to contend with traditional software applications. It's already happening. But the more control the developers get, the more the web can fight, the traditional like native or traditional software applications. I've only just realized your magical joke. How bad is that? I've only just got what you were saying about magical.
No, it's exciting times for CSS. We've been way over. I mean, we could go on for more stuff, but it's been a long time. I think we all have to get back to work. So,
I guess it's afternoon for you guys, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's probably past. It's probably early evening for you, right? You're over in Leeds.
Yeah, Leeds, correct. Yeah. It's 20 past 7 here, 7:20.
Nice.
PM.
We'll let you get back to the fam then.
Cool, thank you.
But thank you so much for coming on. Thanks for joining the panel.
Thank you for having me.
Justin, whatever.
Yep.
And
have a great one, everybody.
This has been episode
nice
number 109, CSS Performance and Maintenance with Harry Roberts, Mark Nadal, or Nadal. You can just smack me later.
Nadal. It's
Nadal. Justin Ribeiro and myself.
You got my name right. That's close enough.
I can't spell your name though, so
nobody can. It's fine.
All right. We'll see you guys later.